Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Leah and I am a member of SUPER, which stands for Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights, Super UW, fun to say. We would first like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Human Rights at UW, our community co-sponsors, and a big thank you to Judith Kolikoff, who is right here, for bringing everybody together. Thank you so much, and we would, of course, like to thank Miko Peled over here for coming to Seattle and presenting tonight. It has been a pleasure. Thank you. So Super UW is a new RSO on campus dedicated to working to educate students in the broader community about the struggle for Palestinian equal rights. Super UW members understand the struggle for Palestinian equal rights as intimately entangled in global struggles for justice, including the struggles of other indigenous peoples around the world, and the structural inequality we face in our own country. As Super UW, we also stand in solidarity with local struggles on the UW campus against racism, sexism, homophobia, and all other forms of oppression and colonization. As an anti-racist organization, Super condemns all forms of hatred and discrimination, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We are both a study group and an action group, so if you're interested in coming to our meetings every other week, please sign up on that pink sign-up sheet over there, and you can sign up to come to events, attend meetings, help organize, and do various different things in the group. And finally, I would like to introduce Miko Peled. Peled is an Israeli author and activist born in Jerusalem to a well-known Zionist family. His father was a young officer in the 1948 war and a general in the War of 1967, and later worked for Palestinian rights. Peled recently authored a book called The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, which provides a compelling critique of many commonly accepted myths about the Israeli state since 1947. And now he will tell you more. Here's Miko Peled.
Thank you, Leah, for that introduction. I just have to say that I really like the name Super. I think it's an excellent name. There are lots of different groups out there that do this sort of work. And the reason I think Super is such a good name because it has the equal rights at the end. And as you'll see in my remarks, I think a big part of this problem has to do with the issue of equal rights, or the lack of equal rights for Palestinians. Let me ask you a couple of questions before I start. First of all, raise your hand if you can, open a map and find Palestine on the map right away, or Israel on the map right away. Okay, cool. All right. Okay, how about raise your hand if you have, if you've been there? Anybody been there? Okay, cool. How about raise your hand if you have family there? Okay, cool. Raise your hand if you have really strong feelings or opinions about the issue. Good. And one final question. Raise your hand if you think that there will be a solution to the conflict in your lifetime.
Not mine.
Raise your hand up high if you think there will be a solution for this problem in your lifetime. Don't be afraid. Okay, good. Thank you. Raise your hand if you think there won't be a solution in your lifetime. Okay, and everybody else is kind of on the fence. So I always like to share this little story. I gave a talk in front of an 8th grade class a few months ago. They were discussing this issue, and it was kind of a special school. It's not a regular public school. And they were discussing this issue, and then they invited me to come and speak. And the class themselves took a poll to see what they thought. And they asked themselves this exact question, and 80% thought that a solution was not possible in their lifetime. They're 13 years old. And of course, how we form opinions on something like this has to do with the information we have. And what I told them when I began my remarks is that I was hoping that by the end of my talk, I would be, their minds would be, they would think differently. They would have a more hopeful point of view. And the encouragement that I get, especially since my book's been out the last few months, probably the most common comment that I get about the book is that people feel a sense of hope when they've read it. And so I'm hoping at the end of this talk that maybe I can convince more of you that the solution will be resolved in all of our lifetimes. Certainly I believe it's going to happen within my lifetime. Now before I kind of actually get into the actual presentation, I always like to make a little disclaimer or warning. And that is that if you've come here hoping to hear a balanced presentation, then you're going to be sorely disappointed. Because this is not a balanced presentation. As you all indicated, almost everybody has strong feelings and strong opinions about this issue. So I don't think a balanced presentation is possible, period. Besides, for me, this is a very personal issue. And besides, it's not a balanced situation. So you can't really have a balanced presentation on something that there's so much imbalance. So I'd like to put that out front. A lot of the things that I say are very difficult for some people to hear, particularly for people who have strong connections to the state of Israel, because I'm very critical of Israel. And so I want you to just kind of be prepared for that, okay? And then later on we'll have a Q&A and everybody will be able to ask questions if they have them. One of the myths that I think sheds a cloud over this issue, excuse me, is that people say, well, this conflict's been going on for generations, for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, and therefore there's really no hope to find a solution, certainly not in my lifetime. Because it's been going on for so long, it's so complicated, people have been killing each other forever. And I would argue that a good place to start talking about this conflict is November 29, 1947. It's not true that this has been going on for generations and for thousands of years. And I think really that November 29, 1947 is an excellent time, is an excellent point with which to begin talking about this issue. And what happened on that day is that the United Nations decided to partition the land, which was called Palestine up to that point, into two states. One state for the Jewish people who were living there, and one state for the Palestinian Arabs who were living there. Now just to make it absolutely clear, Palestine and Israel are the exact same place. It's two names for the exact same place. And I will call it different, I will use both names. But I think without even looking at the details, if you take a look at this map, anybody can see that it's an absurd map. I mean, how do you even begin to, defend or do anything with a boundary like this, with such weird boundaries? And indeed, it really did not last even one day. Now what's interesting is, between the end of 1947 and the end of 1948, the entire country changed. And the argument that exists between the two sides is what exactly took place. Now, the change that occurred over that 12-month period is that the Israeli state, the Jewish state, managed to conquer, or its forces conquered almost 80% of the country within that 12-month period, destroy about 500 towns and villages to the ground, and exile almost 1 million people. That's a lot of stuff to do within 12 months. That's a big change. The country was transformed completely. Now, the story that we hear, the common story, the common thing that we learn about this issue, or what transpired within those 12 months, is that as soon as the United Nations accepted this resolution, the Arabs attacked the Jewish state with the intention of destroying it. So this poor little Jewish state, this fledgling state, was just created. Finally, the Jewish people received this recognition from the international community, from the United Nations, and the Arabs attacked in order to destroy it. Now, it's interesting because the two communities that were living there, the Palestinian community and the Jewish community, were both states in the making. They both had institutions, and they were both preparing to become a state. Hoping, of course, to have the entire country, but preparing to become a state. But there was one difference between the two. There was one thing that the Jewish community, the Israeli community, had developed that the Palestinians did not. And that's a fighting force, a militia. By that time, the militia that was developed, the Zionist militia that was developed, numbered close to 40,000 fighters, armed fighters. And my dad was one of them. My father volunteered to fight for that cause. And there was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no army, there was no fighting force on the Palestinian side. In fact, Palestinians have never had an army. So when we hear the story that the Arabs somehow attacked, you wonder who exactly attacked and what did they attack with? Because there was no Palestinian fighting force. There was no Palestinian militia. Now, it's true that the other Arab armies, Egypt and several other armies, were put together to join this battle, to join this war. But that wasn't until 6 months later. So that already takes care of kind of, demystifying this myth. And in reality, what turns out is that it was the Jewish forces, the Zionist forces. And I like to use the word Zionist rather than Jewish because I like to differentiate between Zionists, who are Jewish people who fight and believe in the state of Israel, and Jewish people who some do, some don't. But the Zionist forces began a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in order to push out as many Palestinians as they could from the country and gain as much land as possible for their state, for the state of Israel. And once again, within a 12-month period, they were able to conquer almost 80% of the country, destroy 500 towns and villages, including schools and churches and mosques and, of course, homes, and force into exile almost 1 million people. And we see how this myth kind of, like I said, gets demystified once we actually look at the details. And by the end of that war, the map looked like this. So Israel was everything except for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That's almost 80% of the country. Now, this kind of gives you an idea of all the other countries in the region. Now, what I did in my book, and the way I like to tell the story is, and the way I learned about this issue has to do, some of it has to do with the things that I learned from my own family, because my family was heavily involved with the creation of the Jewish state, with the creation of the state of Israel. My father fought, like I said, he was an officer in the militia, in the Jewish militia, and my grandfather was a Zionist leader. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And I have a picture here of my mother when she was young. She's 86 now. And she was born and raised in Jerusalem. And she used to tell me how when she was a child, she used to walk around the different neighborhoods in Jerusalem and see the, watch the families and so on. And there were several Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And just to make it clear, there's the old city of Jerusalem, which is surrounded by a wall, but there are also neighborhoods in what's called West Jerusalem, which is kind of a more modern city. And there are Palestinian neighborhoods there. She would walk around and see the families and so on. It was a very pleasant kind of a thing for her to do on a weekend, on a Saturday afternoon. Now, in 1948, when these neighborhoods, when the Zionist forces took over these neighborhoods and forced the Palestinians to leave, the homes, and these are very beautiful homes that still exist, were given to Israeli families. And my mother was offered one of those families. Her husband was out in the front fighting for the cause of the Jewish state, for the cause of the Zionist cause. And she was living in a small apartment with her mother and 2 young children, my 2 older siblings. And so she was offered one of these homes. And the comment that she made was, her first thought about this was, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How can I move into the home of another mother who is now forced to live with her family in a refugee camp somewhere? And then she would tell me a story that I heard later on from many Palestinians who had homes in those neighborhoods, that when the soldiers came in, the coffee was still warm on the table. In other words, they had to leave at a moment's notice. And then my mother would describe the truckloads of loot that the Israeli forces would take from these homes, because these are well-to-do homes, well-to-do families. So furniture and rugs and everything. In her sense, to this day when she talks about it, she feels such a sense of shame for these people for behaving this way. Now, as I was growing up, I heard this story many, many times, And it always bothered me, and it wasn't until recently that I could reconcile the story and understand why it was bothering me, what the problem was. And I realized the problem of the story is that it contradicts the narrative that I learned in school, the narrative that we all learn. Because if the Arabs attacked, who exactly the Arabs are, I'm not sure, but if the Arabs attacked, as the story goes, and then we defended ourselves and won, and then the Arabs left, because that's part of the story, that nobody was forced into exile, but the Arabs left. So there's no moral issue here. Why didn't you take the house? There's no moral problem. And if there is a moral issue here, then what is it? You know, as a child when you grow up, and even as a, you know, as a young adult, you hear two different stories and you try to figure, you know that something is wrong here. And that's exactly how I felt. It wasn't, like I said, so many years later when I actually was working on the book that I could reconcile this. Now, the title of the book is The General's Son, and the subtitle is Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and this is my father, the general, when he was a general. And he had a very, you know, he had a very respectable military career. Once the Israeli state was created, the Israeli army, the militias became the Israeli army, he stayed as an officer. And then 20 years later, in June of 1967, the drums of war were beating once again. And again, this war is also a very interesting war, and a lot has been written about it, the causes for the war, who started it, why they started it. And like I said, he was a general at that time already. Now, the story that we hear about this war is very similar to the story that we hear about the war of 1948. And that is that the Arab armies were intending to attack the state of Israel once again, and planning to destroy it, and this notion of pushing them into the sea, pushing the Jewish people into the sea, the Israelis into the ocean. And there was a real sense of fear that this is what was going to happen. But this is the story that's being perpetuated and told and perpetuated and told so many, many years, for so many years. Now, what I did when I was working on this book, one of the things that I was able to do was go into the Israeli Army archives. And the archives, you know, I learned a lot about my father's career. It was a very interesting military career. But beyond that, one portion that I really wanted to see were the minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to the war. Now, I'm not the first one to see them. Others have seen them and written books about them, because what exactly transpired in those weeks and days leading up to the war is very interesting. So as I was looking at that, I wasn't really, as I went to see this, I wasn't expecting to see anything dramatic, anything that I hadn't heard or seen before. But the first thing that I noticed was a comment that my father made, and then some of the other generals made, and that is that, in fact, the Egyptian army, which was the army that everybody thought was going to attack, is not prepared for war. And I'm going to go back to this map here for just a second, just to give you an idea. So you see the state of Israel, and you see the Sinai Peninsula, and then you see Egypt, right? So what had happened was the Egyptian president entered his troops into the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was supposed to be demilitarized, and UN peacekeepers were there. So he kicked out the UN peacekeepers, and he entered his forces into the Sinai Peninsula. And then you see where it says Saudi Arabia. Between Saudi Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula, those straits are called the Straits of Tiran. And the Egyptian president Nasser was threatening to close them, which meant that Israeli boats couldn't go up those straits all the way to the port city of Eilat. So the generals, of course, saw this as a cause for war. The Israeli cabinet was a little more hesitant. They said, well, maybe we can resolve this somehow diplomatically. I'll go back to this. And this tug of war began between the two groups, the Israeli cabinet and the generals, going back and forth. And finally, the cabinet succumbed and agreed, and the Israeli army was given permission to begin a preemptive strike against the Egyptians. But in the minutes of the meetings, that comment that was made by my father and several others was that in fact the Egyptian army is not prepared for war. That it would take the Egyptian army at least 1.5 years to 2 years before they're fully prepared for war. So the fact that they entered their forces closer to us is actually an opportunity for us to very easily destroy the Egyptian army. So not only there's no threat, no existential threat, but there's an opportunity They saw this as an opportunity to destroy the Egyptian army one more time, and that would have been the third time that the Israeli army had done that. Well, this is huge. There was no threat. Everybody talks about the existential threat that existed in 1967 and how miraculously the state of Israel was able to defend itself. Now I'll go back to this map so you can take a look at what happened. Now the war lasted 6 days. And in 6 days, Israel was able to destroy the Egyptian army, then destroy the Jordanian army, see Jordan over there, take the West Bank, destroy the Syrian army up in the north and take the Golan Heights. Once the war in Egypt, against Egypt, went by very smoothly, within days Israel was able to destroy the Egyptian army and take the Sinai Peninsula. Then the generals themselves decided to take the West Bank and the Golan Heights, which were two areas that they had wanted for many years. Israel had wanted those two regions as part of the state of Israel for a long time. So in 6 days, they were able to take all of that land. On top of that, they were also able to kill up to more than 15,000 Arab soldiers, at a loss to Israel of 700 soldiers. And of course, every soldier is a mother's son, so it's a tragic death. At the same time, the ratio is stunning. 15,000 are killed on one side and 700 are killed on the other. Now, the myth says that Israel was attacked by all these Arab armies and then defended itself. But how do you do all this in 6 days when you're the one that has to defend yourself? But again, when we look at the minutes of the generals and we actually take a look at what actually took place, we'll see that had nothing to do with the threat. There was no threat. This was an opportunity to once again destroy the Arab armies and increase the size of the state of Israel. And that's exactly what they did in 6 days. That's quite a remarkable feat. This is a picture that I always like to show. This is the victory picture. These are the generals, and in the gentleman in the center is at the time was the president of the state of Israel. Israel has kind of, and you see in this picture, you see the two different generations. You see the president, the gentleman in the center is kind of an older Jew. He came from exile. He was, and then you see these new young generals, and all of them were almost all of them were born in Israel or in Palestine, it was called at the time. And they were new, and they were assertive, and they were strong, and they delivered, after 2,000 years, they delivered the land of Israel back to the Jewish people. And this, they were able to, the numbers vary, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people were forced into exile. As soon as, after the 6-Day War, 1967 war, once again, hundreds of thousands were expelled from their homes, were forced out of their homes. Towns and villages were destroyed, and a massive campaign of building cities and towns for Israelis, for Israeli Jews, began. Just like after 1948, after 1967, they did the exact same thing, with the intention of making sure that all these conquests could not be reversed. Could not be reversed. So this whole thing becomes the state of Israel. Cities, towns, highways, shopping malls, schools, industry, you name it, are all part of the state of Israel. But then there's another part. The other part is this country, people forget, or people like to forget, was an Arab country for 1,500 years. It was under Arab and Muslim rule for 1,500 years. So it has the Arab characteristics, and it's also right in the center of the Arab world. So another process that Israel began was a process of de-Arabizing the country, which means changing names, it means destroying monuments, it means changing the history and changing the narrative. So rather than talking about the varied history of this country, what they try to do is to try to connect the state of Israel of today with the biblical kingdom of Israel that may or may not have existed 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And what's interesting, this is a process that takes place every day and has been taking place every day over the last 65 years. The latest example, and probably the most striking one that I like to bring up, takes place right outside the old city of Jerusalem in a place called Silwan. It's a neighborhood of 50,000 people. It's a Palestinian neighborhood. It sits right outside the old city of Jerusalem. And somebody decided that under Silwan sits the ancient kingdom, the ancient city of King David. Now there's no historical proof that King David ever lived. Israeli archaeologists have been digging and digging and looking for proof for a very long time. There is no historical proof that he ever lived. Still, they decided to destroy the homes of the people in Siwan, expel them forcibly, and dig and dig and dig and create what they call this archaeological park called the City of David. And you see tour buses stopping along the way to see this beautiful City of David, completely disregarding the fact that a community of 50,000 people have to be expelled from their homes, and their homes are destroyed. In the areas that are slightly farther away from the park itself, the so-called park, you see Israeli settlers moving in, Israeli Jewish settlers moving into homes. So it's a process of ethnic cleansing, it's a process of de-Arabizing, and it's a process of rebuilding or recreating this myth all at the same time, and this is just one example. Can you imagine a city of 50,000 people in the US, somebody would come and say, you know, we think that there might be some historical remnants under the ground, so we're going to kick everybody out. But this is the process. Now, my father did something very interesting. After the war was over, after the 1967 war was over, he stood up at the very first meeting of the generals and he said, look, we now have an opportunity to allow the Palestinians to create a state of their own and make peace with the Palestinian people, the people with whom we share this country. And everybody looked at him like he lost his mind and ignored him. A year later, he retired from the military, and he continued for the rest of his life to push for this, what's called a two-state solution, a solution where the Palestinians would be allowed to create their own state, and I'll go back to that map for you, in the West Bank and Gaza. And the other thing he also advocated was equal rights for the Palestinians who remained within the state of Israel. Because there's a large Palestinian population after 48 remained, and they became citizens of the state of Israel. But like I said, Israel immediately after the war began a massive campaign of building settlements and of ethnic cleansing, and this whole process of de-Arabizing and so on, like I described, went right into the West Bank, just like in other parts of the country, with the intention of, like I said, creating one state, one country, all for the Israeli Jews. Now going back to this picture, in this picture so one of the things that happened after my father and several other Israelis were talking about this, they began contacts, or they were contacted I should say, by the PLO, which was the Palestine Liberation Organization, who were also looking for ways to negotiate this conflict and end the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they also thought that this two-state solution was a good idea. And for many, many years, these contacts, this dialogue, went on, but what was interesting is on the Palestinian side, you had official representatives of the Palestinian people. On the Israeli side, you had renegades. You had people who used to hold high office, people who had a reputation, but who really did not represent anyone. They represented themselves. So it really was not an equal kind of dialogue. It wasn't a negotiation, I should say. And every time my father would return from these meetings, they were always done either in Europe or North Africa, they always took place there, he would come back and he would report back to the Prime Minister. So the Israeli government was fully aware of this, but would have nothing to do with it. They refused completely to recognize and to speak with the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, under any circumstances. Until 1993. Something happened in 1993, some of you may recall, the Oslo Accords, the Oslo Peace Accords were signed in September of 1993 on the White House lawn, the famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. And what happened in 1993? Why was Israel suddenly willing to negotiate a peace agreement? The only reason Israel was willing to negotiate a peace agreement at that point is because they knew for certain that a Palestinian state could no longer be established. They knew for certain the conquest of the West Bank was final and could not be reversed. The building of cities and towns, like I said, and highways and industry and whatnot, made it so the West Bank was completely a part of Israel and could never be changed into a Palestinian state. And that is when Israel was willing to begin negotiations, not in order to allow the Palestinians a state and make peace, but in order to bring the Palestinian leadership to hold the people down so they don't resist. And of course, when everything fell apart, they blamed the Palestinians for not being willing to negotiate, for not being willing to make concessions. Now, some of you may recall also that 7 years later, in the year 2000, President Bill Clinton invited the Israeli Prime Minister Barak and Yasser Arafat to Camp David to close the deal. And then after days and days and days and days of negotiating, they came out with no agreement. And the comment that Bill Clinton made, and I'll never forget this, he said Arafat gave some and Barak gave more. Barak was the Israeli Prime Minister. Meaning, essentially, it's the Palestinians' fault. The Palestinians were not willing to make concessions. I have another map here. Take a look at these maps. Okay? The map on your right, okay, is the map of the region. You see the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip are about 20% of the entire country. The Palestinians, when they agreed, when they talked about the two-state solution, they had made a massive concession. They agreed to give up 80% of their homeland and forgo the right of the refugees to ever return to their homeland, millions of people who were thrown out, who by now count a number of millions of people, or ever be compensated, for the sake of peace. To say the Palestinians were not willing to make concessions is probably one of the biggest lies that has ever come up within this conflict. They made a massive concession. Now, if you look at the map on your left, this is kind of the West Bank enlarged. And if you see the dark tan areas, that is what Israel was proposing to the Palestinians as a state. What Israel and the United States tried to make Arafat do is sign a surrender, to bring him to his knees and make him surrender completely. And that he was not willing to do. He was willing to give up 80% of his country and the right of the refugees to return for peace, which is a massive concession. But because he wasn't willing to agree to this other thing, to complete surrender, he was vilified, and then, as you may remember, 4 years later, he died in his small office in Ramallah with Israeli tanks surrounding him. But it wasn't for peace, it was for surrender that they wanted him to sign. Now, this occupation, this conflict, has a price. And my own personal story that has to do with this, once again, is this little girl is my sister's little girl, and she was killed in September of 1997 in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. She was 13 years old. Now, when a little 13-year-old girl is killed, is blown up, just walking downtown, to buy school books, you don't really know how to explain it, you don't know how to feel about it. It's something that just completely leaves you speechless and empty. Now, because she was a granddaughter of a famous general, this was big news in Israel. And not only was he a famous general, but he was also a proponent of peace with the Palestinians. So this was immense news. And when I landed, I was living in the U.S. already. When I landed, when I arrived at my sister's apartment in Jerusalem, I saw the morning paper, and the front page of the morning paper had the granddaughter of General Peled killed by Palestinians. And there were, countless numbers of reporters who came to my sister's apartment, and of course, people who came to express their sorrow. And there were a lot of people there for the entire week of the 7 days of mourning. And when my sister came out finally to see everybody after the funeral, she was asked, what do you say about revenge and retaliation? And the first thing that came out of her mouth was, no real mother would want the same thing to happen to any other mother. So don't talk to me about killing more people. And motherhood is something that unites all people, all religions, all faiths, all colors. And then when she was asked who she thought was responsible, she said, well, these two young men blew themselves up, took my daughter and several other innocent Israelis with them. The level of despair, the level of hopelessness that must have driven them to do this was brought about by the brutal oppression of the state of Israel. The brutal oppression with which Israel keeps the Palestinians. It's an occupation that is brutal, that kills people, that takes away their freedom, takes away their water, takes away their land, arrests their brothers and their fathers, gives them absolutely no hope. And when we put people under such conditions, this is what happens. I point a finger at my own government for putting these people in such a state of hopelessness that they would be willing to take their own lives and take other innocent civilians with them. Now, she went on to become an activist and work very hard to bring about change and reconciliation, and to criticize, of course, the ongoing occupation, the ongoing brutal oppression of the Palestinians, and her husband Rami as well. And when I came back to the U.S., because I was living here at the time, I thought, okay, well, what do I do? You can't just get up in the morning and go back to work. I mean, life changed forever. There's nothing anybody can do about that. And I was fortunate enough that I found a dialogue group, a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group where I live in San Diego. And I joined it, and I began talking to people. And this was the very first time, I was almost 40 years old, it was the first time I ever met Palestinians. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem. It's supposed to be a mixed city. But it's also a completely segregated city. So the only way a young Israeli boy going to school would see Palestinians was, the market, or doing landscaping, or washing dishes. The communities are completely segregated. First time I met Palestinians, and not only did I meet them for the first time, but I was in a situation where we were completely equal. Because back in Israel, Palestine, we're not equal. They either need to get back on time because there's a curfew, or they need a permit, or they need one thing or another. The laws that govern them, the laws that govern me are different. Over here, we're completely equal. We can talk and we can say what we want, and when we were done, we all went home. And very gradually, I began to learn from them about the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinian side of the story. And it was a process that is so painful that it's hard to even begin to imagine. The point in dialogue is not that you point fingers, but that you just tell your story. So I told my story, and then they told their stories. And their stories included things that happened to their families, and some of them themselves, that were hair-raising. We're talking about massacres. They're talking about mass expulsions. They're talking about arrests and torture, things that I didn't think were happening. I didn't think Israelis do these things. Israelis are the good guys. Yeah, we make mistakes, we're not perfect, but we're the good guys. The Israeli army is a good army. I served in the Israeli army. My dad was a general. Are you kidding? We don't do these things. I came from a point where I really thought I knew what I was talking about. And at one point, I just couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know what to make of it. So I called Israel. I have an older brother who teaches political science, and I asked him in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and I asked him, is any of this true? I mean, have these Palestinians now, other people came and went, other Jews and Israelis would listen to these Palestinians and say, oh, they're a bunch of extremists. How can you listen to these people? And would never come back. And I thought, they're not extremists. They're there because the same reason I'm there. We're here to meet each other and to work this out, figure something out, see why this is happening. And my older brother said, well, as a matter of fact, what they said does have merits. And that just shortly before that, several Israeli historians had rewritten, so to speak, the history of the conflict, the history of 1948. Ilan Papi, you may have heard, was probably the most notable one, and Avi Shleim and others. And so he said, you should read their books and see what, take a closer look at what took place. And that's what I did. I went to the library and I bought the books that I needed. And it turns out that these historians were validating everything the Palestinians were saying for decades. But of course, when the Palestinians were saying this, it's not good enough. You can't believe the Palestinians because they're liars, because they're Arabs. But we can believe an Israeli who says it's okay, who says it's true. Now, not everybody believes them either, but it was much easier to believe that. And then I began learning a little bit more, and when I went to Israel, I would go into Palestinian territories, I'd go to Palestinian communities within Israel, I became active. And as I was doing this, the first thing that I noticed was this sign. And this is a sign that you see when you cross the checkpoints, when you cross the crossings between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And it's a massive sign, and it's almost the sign, the size of this wall. And as you can see, the colors indicate danger. And what this sign says is that this road leads to Area A, which is under Palestinian control. And the entry for Israelis into Area A is forbidden it is life-threatening, and it is a felony. And as you can see, it ends not with one, but with 2 exclamation marks. In other words, if everything you read so far, the danger colors didn't scare you and get your attention, the 2 exclamation marks will do it. And of course, none of this is true unless you can read Hebrew. Because if you can't read Hebrew, you can't understand what it says. And the sign is in Hebrew. And of course, like I always say, if you have any sense at all and you see a sign that spells danger like this, you turn and run the other way. And thankfully, I didn't have that kind of sense. And many other people that I know don't have that kind of sense. And I pursued it and went all the way through, when I went past the sign and through to the other side, and I've been doing it for many, many years now. And every time I look at that sign and I think, it's interesting because when I cross the other side, I always see the same things. Probably the most common thing you see when you enter Palestinian cities are kids going to school. Little kids with backpacks on. All year round, almost every day. And the other thing you see is, cars, you see traffic, you see people going to work, you see shops, you see markets. I haven't found the danger yet. I've been doing this for more than 10 years. I haven't seen the danger. I haven't seen the Palestinian who's standing there waiting to kill me because I'm an Israeli. And then over the years I began to think, well, there's a sign, there's a massive wall, as I think you probably know. There are Israeli soldiers who are armed to the teeth. There's the terrorizing and humiliation that Palestinians go through every time they have to cross the checkpoint from one to the other. Palestinians, not Israelis. There's the terrible humiliation and terrorizing that Palestinians go through when they want to fly out of Tel Aviv airport. And this is true for Israeli citizens. Palestinians are Israeli citizens. Hours and hours of interrogations and body searches and strip searches and just really terrorizing by the airport security. And it began to dawn on me, none of this has anything to do with security or safety. None of it has anything to do with security or safety. All of this is meant to do 2 things. Keep one side afraid and the other side angry and frustrated. Because as long as one side is afraid and the other side is angry, there will never be peace. And the 2 sides will never get along. And that is the point. And that is why they try to keep people apart. And that's why they try to keep people like myself and others from meeting with Palestinians. Now, this is a picture of myself and a Palestinian friend of mine who was sent in an Israeli prison for many, many years. In fact, he was given a life sentence, but he was exchanged in one of the prisoner exchanges between Israel and the PLO. And he sat in prison. He was given a life sentence because he killed a soldier. And in fact, he and 3 others snuck behind 2 armed soldiers at some kind of a post where they were guarding in the West Bank in Ramallah, and they stabbed him to death. And of course, they were caught, they were in prison, and so on. Now, it's very interesting to hear the story because in terms of what we know, in terms of what we think, he's a terrorist with blood on his hands. That's how he's regarded in Israel. A security threat with blood on his hands. But if you read the resolution on top, it's a United Nations resolution from 1973. And what it says is that the struggles of people under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes, which by the way describe the state of Israel precisely, for the implementation of their right to self-determination and independence is legitimate and in full accordance with the principles of international law. I didn't write this. This is the United Nations resolution. Now, I served in the Israeli army for 3 years. I was a soldier in an occupation army. An army that was dedicated to keeping Palestinians, like my friend Jamal here, oppressed, off their land. We'll figure it out. Anyway, the interesting thing is, I was a member of an army. I was a soldier in an army that is dedicated to all of these missions that are illegal, inherently illegal. He fought, as this resolution describes, he struggled under a colonial, alien domination and a racist regime. Which one of the 2 of us, which is the question I like to present, which one of the 2 of us is the terrorist? which one of the two of us was part of a terror organization? And I think this is an important question for people to think about. I'll say one more thing about the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian prisoners. Israel has always held, for decades, Israel has held thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners in its jails in violation of international law. Thousands and thousands of prisoners. Less than 10% of the Palestinian prisoners, less than 10% are in prison for acts of violence. Less than 10% are in prison because of acts of violence. And then when we look at, and when we look at the history of the Palestinian resistance, we can understand why. Because the vast majority of Palestinian resistance has always been nonviolent. The violent resistance has been very dramatic and very painful. But the vast majority, and this is true today as well, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance has been nonviolent. And it's represented in the Palestinian prisoners because most of those thousands of prisoners are held because of political reasons, because they resist. They're not terrorists and they're not security prisoners, they are political prisoners. And I think this is a distinction that's very, very important to make. The final question that I address in the book, and I think it's something we need to talk about, and I hope to address clearly tonight, is where do we go from here? The reality is that two nations live on that country, live on that land. You've got about 6.5 million Israelis and about 5.5 million Palestinians. By 2020, there will probably be more Palestinians than there are Israelis. Typically, Palestinians have more children. And everyone is governed by the state of Israel. In other words, all of this is Israel. If you look at any Israeli maps, Israeli school books, nature trails, weather map, this is the state of Israel, all of it. If you listen with Israeli Prime Minister and others, Israeli officers, generals, or just commanders on the ground, they'll tell you there's no difference between Tel Aviv and, I don't know, Ma'ale Adumim, which is a settlement, city in the West Bank. There's no difference between Haifa and Halamish, I don't know, another settlement, another small town, Israeli town in the West Bank. There are no differences. This is all one and the same. So this is all one country, and it was one state, and it was created by the state of Israel as such. But half of the population, or close to half of the population, are not Israeli Jews. Yet Israel wants to claim that this is a Jewish state. And the way Israel governs is very interesting. And the way they're able to present it this way is very interesting. You've got laws that govern people like myself, Israeli Jews. And those are pretty much completely democratic laws. We're free to say what we want, write what we want, go where we want, come as we please. Then you have the laws that govern the Palestinians, who are citizens of the state of Israel. And Israel supporters like to say that Israel is just, it's got equality and equal rights. There are over 30 laws in the Israeli law books that discriminate against the Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. There are 1.5 million of them. 30 laws that discriminate against them. And there's an entire culture of discrimination. If you can imagine the southern states of the United States before civil rights, you didn't really need laws for the racism to exist. So there's an entire culture of racism against them because they're Arabs. And their communities are completely neglected. In some cases, worse off than people in Gaza. Completely neglected. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody that was ever given a permit to build anything, build a house or anything. You'd be hard-pressed to see a dime that was invested by the state to build anything for that community. At the same time, you see major cities and major development for Israelis all around, but not for Palestinians. And these are Israeli citizens. Then you have the laws that govern the lives of Palestinians who are not Israeli citizens, who live in the West Bank and Gaza. They live at the mercy of the Israeli army. They can be killed, they can be kidnapped, they can be arrested, they can be tortured, Their homes can be taken away. They're deprived water. They're deprived freedom. They can be deprived medicine. They can be they're deprived the right to go to work and to go to school. They are at the mercy of the Israeli army, which of course is an arm of the Israeli government, which controls the entire thing and governs the lives of every single person that lives there. So when people talk about a possibility of creating two states, it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. Israel set off to create a Jewish state, or a state for what they call the state for the Jewish people, in Palestine, completely disregarding the fact that half the population is neither Jewish or Israeli. And that's exactly what they did. And they do it using these different sets of laws, which is why very often Israel is compared to apartheid South Africa, and is called an apartheid state, because when you have different laws that govern different people, that's what apartheid is. Now Israel has an education system that's dedicated to teach racism. A book just published by my sister, who's an educator, describes how Palestinians or demonstrates how Palestinians are described in Israeli textbooks. And this is, it's a funny way to say it, but it's textbook racism. Palestinians exist in one of three ways. They're either a problem, like an environmental problem, poverty and hopelessness and refugees, or they exist as a threat. If you talk about Palestinian nationality or Palestinian rights, they're a threat because they kill us, they're terrorists, or they don't exist at all. Those are the three categories. And I won't get into that. You should get the book. It's an excellent book. But it demonstrates exactly how it is that young Israelis who were raised in a seemingly democratic society at age 18 can put on a uniform and become animals, which is exactly what they become when they put on the uniform. All right. So anyway, that's a secret. That's kind of the secret ingredient, how you take young people who seemingly grew up in a democracy and become monsters when they put on a uniform. And then Israel has an entire bureaucracy that is charged with creating restrictions and then demanding permits, and creating more restrictions and demanding more permits so as to make the life of Palestinians impossible. And then you have the Israeli army, which I would categorize as one of the best armed, best fed, best financed terrorist organizations in the world. It is an army that, although they have uniforms and commanders and generals and they look very smart, they are dedicated to terrorizing an entire nation. They are dedicated to killing and terrorizing Palestinians. And they do this with American money. And they do this with American arms. And next time somebody asks you, why do they hate us? Invite them to go to Gaza next time American-made F-16s drop American-made phosphorus bombs on civilians. And they will see why they hate us. There's this ridiculous claim that Palestinians are taught to hate in their schools. They don't need to be taught to hate in their schools. They can be taught to hate in the street when they see the Israeli army. When they see their fathers tortured and beaten and killed. When they see their younger brothers and sisters burning with this horrific phosphorus dropped by Israeli Air Force planes. And this is how Israel does it. These are the three arms of the Israeli government that make it all work. So this is all horrific enough, but where do we go from here? Like I said, the notion of an Israeli government ever allowing a Palestinian state to be established is absurd. Israel will never part with any part of the land. Israel cannot be part of any kind of peace because the state of Israel completely contradicts the notion of peace and compromise. However, if we look around the world, if we look at history, we can see that there can be a transition. There can be a transition from a state that's not a democracy, that's a racist state, like South Africa, for example, into a democracy. There are lots of examples around the world where evil regimes were replaced by democracy. And that is the process that has to take place there, so that you have complete equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians, complete equal rights and complete equal opportunities. Does this mean that there won't be a state of Israel? Yes. You cannot have the state of Israel with half the population of Palestinian Arabs. You have to have a state that everybody can share. You have to have a state where everybody can be equal. And then Israelis and Palestinians can move on. It's a beautiful country, it's a rich country, it's rich with culture, it's rich with history, it's rich with promise. And Israelis and Palestinians can definitely live together as enjoying equal rights as citizens of the state and sharing the same homeland. And that's why I have hope, because I know that this can happen. I've seen it happen in lots of other countries, and I think it's inevitable in all of our lifetimes. Thank you very much.
Ask a question without a mic, so this can stay on Miko's tie. And he will take 3 questions at a time. So please keep them brief so you can write them down and give a full answer. If you just come up here, he can hear you, and then he will repeat the question to all of you.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, what percentage of people in Israel have an attitude like yours? And what do you think the tipping point is? What percentage do we need?
Okay. Another question?
Yes. Then you were speaking about peace, and you made a whole prediction that Israelis and Palestinians can come together. I just want to point out that there are movements in the Middle East, and our governments in the Middle East, very heavily armed ones, that derive their almost all their legitimacy from opposing the state of Israel. And don't you think those would be an impediment for the Israelis and Palestinians?
So you mean regimes outside of Israel being an impediment?
Yes. You're on this law.
Okay.
Just your perspective, having lived in the U.S. for a long time, why the U.S. has so wholeheartedly supported Israel, and what people can do in the U.S. to change that.
Okay, I'll answer these 3 and then we'll do the rest, okay? And then we'll do 3 more. Okay, the first question is 2 questions. How many people in Israel support my views, and well, how many do we need to make it work? Well, I would say the percentage of people in Israel who share my views is 0. Without a doubt. Well,
I know one.
You know one?
I know one.
Well, I know maybe 10, so I'm saying. But there's not many. And the thing is this, when you're the privileged, when you enjoy the privileges of that sort of a regime, you're not, terribly keen on giving them up. Whites in South Africa were not terribly keen on having apartheid end, but they had to live with it. They had to realize that apartheid was coming to an end, and they were going to have to live with it. And I think this is true for all regimes that are not democratic. There's always a layer of people who enjoy the benefits, who are privileged. But when the regime is replaced, they have to kind of deal with the new reality that other people have rights as well. And this is the process that Israelis are going to have to go through. Here in the U.S., when racist laws ended, then the people in the South had to deal with it. They didn't like it necessarily. It's not like they said, well, let's stop being bad and let's be nice to colored people. It was a process where they were faced with the reality that democracy is here and they are going to have to deal with it. And they dealt with it quite well. They deal with it in the end quite well. They realize that people may have a different color, they may have a different religion, they may cover their head a different way, but they're still people and we can all get along just fine, as long as we respect each other and we have equal rights and equal opportunities. So I'm not suggesting it's an easy proposition, but I am suggesting it is completely possible. And not only that, an idea that comes up as a result of this is, see, you're talking about genocide. You're talking about another Holocaust. You're talking about destroying Israel and killing Jews. we can't quite say I'm anti-Semitic, but they can say it if somebody who's not Jewish suggests this. And I think it's important to understand the transition of power from a racist, evil regime to democracy does not have to involve violence. There are plenty of examples in the world where this happens, and there's no reason why it can't happen without violence in Israel and Palestine. And suggesting this is not suggesting killing anybody, it's suggesting giving people their rights, allowing people to live, and ending the violence. And there's nothing anti-Semitic about suggesting this. There's nothing anti-Jewish about suggesting this because there's nothing Jewish about the state of Israel. Other than the fact that the Zionist leaders decided that they represent Jews. But it was their decision, nobody ever voted for them. And so, and there are always many, many Jewish people who are anti-Zionist or not Zionist or indifferent to Zionism, but they kind of were self-proclaimed, representatives of the Jewish people. So I'm not suggesting it's an easy thing, but I am suggesting it can be done orderly, it can be done without violence. And I think it's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing for both people. I don't think the Arab regimes are going to be an impediment. I think the impediment to peace has always been the state of Israel. Arab regimes, good and bad, have been asking Israel for peace since pretty much the very beginning the state of Israel was established. Israel has always refused and always decided that it was going to conduct itself like a bully and scare everybody and be the toughest one and the scariest one and have the biggest army and so on. That was a choice that Israel made. And so I don't think any of the Arab regimes will be an impediment. It's true that many of them, like in Jordan, for example, Mubarak, who thank God left, and perhaps others, enjoy a lot of money from the state of Israel and so on. But who knows, that might change. Why America supports Israel, I think, is the million-dollar question. A lot of the money that Israel gets, officially from Israel, $3 billion, which could go to building schools and paying teachers and paying all kinds of other things, building hospitals here in America, a lot of that money comes back here to build weapons, to the weapons industry, because Israel buys weapons and has to buy weapons with a certain amount of that money. So a lot of that comes back here. So that's one part of that. The other part of that is that the AIPAC, which is the Israeli lobby, is a very powerful lobby, and they're very successful. And they managed to create an environment where if you want to be a politician in America, you have to bow to Israel. 5 times a day, at certain given times, you have to say, I like Israel. Or else you will not be elected. And it's true all the way from the president down to any city council members. This is the reality of politics in America. And until somebody actually decides they're going to stop it, it's not going to stop. So America has this very, very strange, sick relationship with the state of Israel, but they do feed off each other. I mean, a lot of the money that America kind of gives Israel comes back. It's kind of like laundering money back into the arms industry. And it's important to remember in this context as well that Israel doesn't need money. Israel is not a developing country. It's not a poor country. It doesn't need American money. We're not saving lives when the money goes there. We're not helping to bring about water or anything like that. It's money that goes to destroy Palestinians. And it's money that goes to support a racist regime that holds thousands of political prisoners and kills people at will. And so it's very important that Americans here make it clear to their politicians that it's time to stop this support. And actually what will be the right thing to do is for American politicians to compete on how much they oppose Israel, not how much they support Israel. Yes, please, we can do 3 more.
Do you mind if I ask you 3 or should?
You can ask 3.
All right, super technical. My first question is about, you mentioned in the 67 war, the Strait of Iran. So here's the thing, you said Egypt was threatening to close it. So when Iran was threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, they didn't just out of thin air say, hey, we want to close it. They said, if Israel attacks us, we'll close it. So it's not what the media has been saying. So I was wondering, did Egypt just out of thin air say, we want to close Timor, or was it in retaliation to a threat or a counter threat? Second question, if ever in my lifetime a 2-state solution is established, geographically, how would you link the West Bank to Gaza? Because everybody says we want to make them a state, but nobody says, well, how are we going to connect them? Because this would, require going through Israeli territory or around the water or anything. So technically how would that work out? And my last question is, last week Palestine deposited its bid at the UN for non-member state. They tried the state last year, it didn't work. Maybe this year the non-member state would work, but do you think if it does work, that would actually move this forward? Or would it just be a step in the right direction, but not really an advancement?
Okay. Well, just for fairness, let's take one more, so that way you're not standing there.
Sorry.
I was just going to ask, like, what you mentioned the youth, and I think that was really a poignant point. And how would you start by dismantling institutions that are involved in apartheid state, and what's the best form of activism? And I think that when you touched on youth, that was something that resonated with me, because they're the future generations and they're the ones that are going to have the say.
Yeah, good point. Are you the last one? Do you want to go ahead and ask one, and we'll just kind of go.
Okay. So just very quickly, so I've heard of one of the major criticisms of the one-state solution. That's not pragmatic, it's not practical, yada 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 yada. So I mean, what is like one state? Even two-state. I've heard both sides. But like for you, what is your favorite vision of a one-state solution? Whether it's a binational state, fully secular, there's different federations within one.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Okay, let's see. The first one was why Egypt. Egypt didn't actually block the Straits of Tiran. It was threatening to block the Straits of Tiran. And why Egypt decided to do those things when it did is it's a big question. I think it's a big enough question for an entire presentation. And there are lots of different theories, and I never got a clear answer. So I'm kind of I'm not crazy about the idea of speculating. But they didn't actually close the Straits of Tiran. The story, well, I will say one version of what took place, just to kind of put a closure on it. What is being said was, and I mentioned this in the book as well, that Egypt was getting some kind of information that Israel was about to attack Syria. It was getting this information from the Russian government. Now Egypt and Syria had a pact in those days. It's called the United Arab Republic. Thank you. And so they had to act in their defense, and that's what propelled the whole thing. But nobody investigated long enough before they started the war. Had they waited a little bit longer and engaged in diplomacy, this probably would have fizzled out. But nobody knows for sure. But they didn't actually do it. They threatened to do it, and this is one of the theories, is that that's why they do that. The two-state solution and how Gaza and the West Bank will be connected, I can't answer that because there will never be a two-state solution. And I can't emphasize this enough. The notion that the state of Israel will agree to part with part of the land is absolutely absurd. It means a complete misreading, or I'd say misunderstanding, of the state of Israel and Zionism. The last 65 years have proven beyond any doubt, if you're just willing to look and read the fine print, that there is never going to be a Palestinian Arab state between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Israel will never allow it. And therefore Israel cannot be a partner to any peace agreement because it refuses to make peace. And that's why what I'm suggesting is the only possibility for peace is a transition from an Israel to a, whatever you'll call it, Israel-Palestine or whatever, which is a state that belongs to everybody, a state where there are equal rights for all the citizens, not only for Israeli Jews. So all these questions, and I'll say one more thing about the two-state solution. It's being used very cynically by many politicians as a fig leaf to allow the ongoing ethnic cleansing and destruction of Palestine by Israel. Because the claim is, what we want is a two-state solution, but we can't have it because Palestinians are terrorists and they won't make concessions, and we can't really talk to them. And this guy's a terrorist, and that guy's Hamas, and this guy's Hamas, and that guy's something else. And there's always a reason why we can't. And they don't recognize us, and they do recognize us. Now, it's not like everything stands still. Israel builds massive cities and towns and highways for Israeli only in the West Bank. The West Bank no longer exists. While they make all these excuses of why a two-state solution is not possible. But it might be in the future once the Palestinians are nice enough. So it's used as a fig leaf to allow all this to continue. That's why it's very important to stop talking about the two-state solution and to talk about the transition from a Zionist state to a democracy. That has to be the conversation. Because as long as we talk about this other distraction, Israel is permitted to continue with its crimes. The UN thing, it's, I don't think it's going to pass, just like the previous attempt to be recognized as a state didn't pass because, you know, Israel, America is kind of in lockstep with Israel, and Israel won't allow it, and it won't make any difference anyway. Even if the United Nations did recognize Palestinians as a state, it matters nothing because Israel has the land, and it won't allow them to do anything. You know, the Palestinians have an authority and they have a president. The Palestinian president needs a permit from the Israeli army that needs to be renewed every 3 months in order to drive around his authority. He cannot get in his helicopter and fly, you know, from one place to another, from one Palestinian city to another, without a permit from the Israeli army. He's not a president, it's a joke. It's a sad joke, but it's a joke. So the whole notion of the two states and a Palestinian state is really a distraction. I think we need to stop talking about it. How do you dismantle institutions of apartheid? I think that's an interesting question. It will be an interesting subject for a paper, I think. I mean, you have to go look at what happened in other countries, other racist countries, and other fascist regimes where these things got dismantled and you had to reinstitute mostly the education system, or reinstate the education system so that they were not racist. But this is an interesting process. And look, the thing to remember is this. What I'm proposing, and it's not me proposing, it's a proposal that's out there by people who are far more knowledgeable and smarter than I am. They've been talking about this for a very long time, both Israelis and Palestinians and others. This is the first step. That's not to say there won't be problems. Show me a state that doesn't have problems. But it's a step that you have to take first. Until we take that step, we won't be able to solve any of the other issues like the institutions of apartheid and racism, and how do you stop teaching people racism. But like I said, I'm optimistic, and I'm mostly optimistic because Israeli and Palestinian societies are very similar. Very, very similar. And if you look at other multi-nation states, if you look at Belgium and Switzerland and India and some others, the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians and the similarities between Israelis and Palestinians are so striking that if this happened tomorrow, it would be seamless. It would be seamless. People think, oh, they're culturally different, they're religiously different, they're this different. They're not so different. First of all, most Israelis and most Palestinians are not that religious. So they have their traditions and they keep them, but they have different levels of religion. Most Israelis and Palestinians, the education levels are very high. Literacy is over 92% on both sides. Both societies have a rich upper class that they hate and they want to get rid of. Very corrupt, very rich. They have corrupt, both sides have very corrupt politicians. I mean, who doesn't? And both sides have a fringe of fanatic religious groups. And they want to see their power diminish. And the only way to diminish their power is to work together, the people in the middle. So the possibilities, and the languages are not that different. Many Palestinians speak Hebrew, many Israelis come from Arab countries. Over 50% of Israelis have their roots in Arab countries. They have families that immigrated from Arab countries, so Arabic is part of their culture. So I mean, I think this is important to realize, and when you form your opinion on whether or not it's possible in your lifetime, it's going to happen. You have to take that into consideration. You know, the claim that one-state solution is not pragmatic, that's a really good point. Because a two-state solution has proven itself to be very pragmatic. I mean, over the last 45 years, it made it absolutely obvious that a two-state solution is very practical and it's right around the corner, except we never reached that corner. So the claim of being pragmatic is one that I like a lot. It's a great exercise. Another thing I'll say is this. I don't know if you remember that Egypt had a president called Mubarak. A year before he was thrown out, if anybody came into a room and suggested that a popular revolution in Egypt would throw out President Mubarak, they would have been sent to an asylum and locked up immediately. It would mean that you completely misunderstand the Middle East, that you completely misunderstand Egypt. There were preparations for his son Jamal to take his place already. He was, I don't know, 150 years old or something. And they were preparing for this. And suddenly, a popular resistance, you know, there's what, 80 million people in Egypt? It took less than 1 million to kick him out. He's gone, you know. So nobody knows what's really pragmatic. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. But we do know that if the right pressures are applied, and the right energy is applied, and the right principles are applied, like human rights, equal rights, civil rights, then things like this become suddenly very pragmatic very quickly. So anyway, do you guys have more questions?
Maybe we can make these three the last.
Yes, yes, definitely. Go ahead.
I have a suggestion more than a question.
Okay.
About what we could perhaps maybe do as American citizens, since funding seems to be the issue, that we're, you know, you're saying that we're funding this, we're giving them this money to start with background weapons and guns. And I actually had the idea when I was watching the sit-ins and the way that the police were treating these people in our own country who were sitting peacefully protesting. I think if we could get enough people to refuse to pay their income taxes, this is a peaceful way to protest, and this is a powerful way to make them in their pocket. They don't have money to give to them. They won't have money to pay the police to attack us when we're trying to protest peacefully.
Now there's a revolutionary idea. I like it. Thank you. Yes?
So my question is a twofold, and I want to go back to the two-state solution. So first of all, you said that in 1993, the Israeli government decided to go into negotiations because it became very clear that there's no way that a Palestinian state would ever exist. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and talk a little more specifically about the circumstances in 93. Secondly, you mentioned the corrupt Palestinian government, and I wanted to ask you whether that's an important factor as well, whether Palestinian politicians stand a lot to gain from both the conflict and the two-state solution.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I'm just having difficulty understanding your optimism, given that you said that something like 0% of Israelis share your opinion. Certainly there's not a great deal of pressure in the U.S. or leverage in the U.S. in favor of that. And that the UN doesn't seem like a mechanism of change that you see. You know, and I agree with those points for the most part. Maybe I think that there are a lot of Israelis who might have different opinions, if not exactly in line with yours. But given all of that, you mentioned we need to have the right pressures applied. I'm just curious about what in fact you see is, if you think that in fact this could change within your lifetime or any of ours, what exactly would that look like?
Okay, good question. Thank you. Okay. I like the first idea with the taxes. You know, so we talked about this the other day. Does anybody here remember there used to be a state called South Vietnam? Some of us are older, remember. And just before South Vietnam disappeared off the face of the earth, President, I think it was Gerald Ford, swore that America will never forsake its ally in Southeast Asia. That, you know, South Vietnam stands in the way of communism and America will never forsake it. It is, you know, it is the only democracy in Southeast Asia, and on and on and on and on and on. And interestingly enough, my father, after he retired, he wrote for one of the Israeli newspapers, Ma'ariv, and they sent him on a mission to South Vietnam to write, and he was there for about 6 weeks. And because he was a retired general, the South Vietnamese generals took him in and talked to him, and you know, he saw a lot of interesting things. And this was, I think it was 1973. It was early 1973, which is pretty much towards, very close to the end of the war. And this was still a time when presidents in America and people, politicians in America were talking about how they will never forsake South Vietnam. And he started writing articles back and he said the Americans are leaving. People said, what are you talking about? They're swearing up and down that they will never leave. He said, yes, but there are no more spare parts. The army is not getting spare parts. So if an army jeep has, you know, goes on, you know, gets blown on, you know, on a minefield or something, then it's gone. There's not going to be another one. And that was the first signs. So, you know, the possibility, when Americans want to accomplish something, they know how to do it. When Americans decided to leave Vietnam, that was it. The American people spoke, Congress listened, the president listened, it was done. So if Americans want $3 billion a year, plus the other $2 billion that are given as donations and stuff like that, from not-for-profit, tax-exempt donations and stuff like that, that's a lot of money that could go to good use here in the U.S. They know what to do, and stop paying taxes is a good idea. Okay, what happened in 1993? Well, several things happened in 1993. First of all, like I said, it was absolutely clear that the conquest and the building in the West Bank was irreversible. So the Israelis didn't really have to worry about anything. The other thing, there was plenty of pressure applied on Israel and on the US to do something about the Palestinian problem. So they figured out a way to do something without achieving results, which is this ongoing, endless negotiation. So they recognized the PLO, they shook hands with the PLO, they allowed some money to come into the PLO, they found a few corruptible leaders that were willing to come in and sit in. Now, not all of them were corruptible. I don't want to create this impression that all Palestinian leaders are corrupt. I think many Palestinians and Palestinian leaders believed that this was the beginning of the end and that this was going to be the end of the war and that there will be a Palestinian state. There's no question that they were duped by many of them were duped by Israel and by the US. But the atmosphere around the world, was the end, the Berlin Wall fell and apartheid in South Africa fell, and it was kind of a time of hope and change in the world. So it looked like this was also going to go in that same direction. There was a lot of pressure on Israel to do this. And finally, there were a couple of Israeli and American people who thought this Oslo thing is a good idea. It's kind of a small thing. We give them a little bit of Gaza, which we really don't want anyway. We'll give them a little bit of Jericho, which nobody cares about anyway. And let's start with that. And then they started delaying and delaying and postponing because they had deadlines. They had benchmarks, I should say, for when Israel should pull out, and when Palestinians can get independence, and Israel completely ignoring these benchmarks. I remember in 1995, just before my father died, there was a big interview with him in the paper, in the Israeli paper, because he had cancer, and people kind of knew that he was on his way. And the headline, this was in the weekend paper, which is a big deal in Israel, and the headline on the cover was, Matti Peled says, Rabin does not want peace. This was 1995, anybody remember? That was the height of Oslo. Rabin was the man of peace. Nobel Peace Prize and whatnot. And people said, are you out of your mind? How can you say that? He said, well, I read the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords are not going to lead to peace. They're not talking about a peace. They're talking about surrender and complete Israeli control over the lives of Palestinians. So, on the one hand, you had this atmosphere that required the Israelis to engage in something. Plus, there's a lot more money coming from the U.S., plus they made Bill Clinton look much better, plus, there's all these Nobel Peace Prizes out there to be given out. So it was the atmosphere to do things. At the same time, they figured out how to not accomplish anything. Now, yes, all corrupt leaders, when people talk about Palestinian corruption, I like to remind them that out of 12 Israeli prime ministers, 5 were charged with corruption. Or at least suspicion of corruption. Not all of them are actually charged because they are prime ministers, and so they do have some benefits. Some privileges, but Sharon, Sharon, had he been alive, he'd probably been in jail. Or he's alive, but he's not, kind of alive. Corrupt leaders, it's not the end of the world, but of course it's something we see everywhere. And of course, corrupt leaders and corrupt people like conflict because you have to sell arms and you have to sell cement for the wall and you have to do all kinds of things. So there's a lot of profits, there's a lot to be gained by war, and a lot of corrupt people are enjoying this. I think the biggest criminals of all are the arms dealers. Look at Syria. I think if anybody has to, and I don't believe in violence at all. I'm a pacifist, but I think in the case of Syria, the people who sell arms to Syria to both sides should be tried, if not, hung. Okay, my optimism. You're right. There is no, Israeli public opinion does not support this notion at all. I mean, there are a few Israelis that talk about this. There should be no reason to think that the US would ever support this unless Israel supports this, or unless for some reason it becomes politically acceptable. And the United Nations has no teeth. We can't rely on the United Nations because Israel has never respected any United Nations resolutions. So why am I optimistic? Well, I can't be an activist if you're not optimistic. I mean, you can't. I mean, what's the point of doing all this if you're not optimistic? Might as well hit your head against the wall. But there are certain things that are taking place that give me hope. From the outside, you see there is a change. You know, I'm going to be speaking, I've been speaking for several weeks now around the country. I'm going to be speaking probably till Thanksgiving, nonstop. And a lot of the invitations that I get are by American Jews. There's this notion that American Jews support Israel. But they like to create the notion that the people who support Zionism are the mainstream. They're not the mainstream. And more American Jews are looking at this Zionist thing in the state of Israel, and they're saying, you know what, we don't necessarily support a country that has thousands of political prisoners and acts this way. And not every time we go to, you know, to worship on a Saturday, we want to see the Israeli flag, who represents for many people, represents evil. So there is a trend of more and more American Jews disassociating themselves from Zionism, and there's a trend, generally speaking, you know, around the country. I don't know if you know, like a lot of colleges have like Students for Justice of Palestine, or like they have here, and they have these week-long, you know, Palestine Week or Israeli Apartheid Week, and this only started 5-6 years ago. I think in California, and there were 2 or 3 colleges that, you know, that held these. Last year there were 120 colleges that held, you know, Palestine Awareness Week and Apartheid Week. And thousands and thousands and thousands of students saw this and participated and learned about this. I spoke at several, a lot of, you know, speakers, wonderful speakers, who talk about this issue. So there's a growing number of people, young people, who are learning about this. And these young people who are members of all these different groups and conduct these are amazing people. They're not all Palestinian, by the way. Some of them are Jewish, some of them are not, but these are people who care enough to actually put this together. And it's not easy. They fight the pro-Israel groups, they fight the administration. It's not an easy thing, not an easy task. And so that's another thing that's taking place here in the US. You may have heard of the BDS movement. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It's taken from the model of fighting apartheid in South Africa. It's very effective. It's very small, but it's very effective. You know, when the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra goes to play at Royal Albert Hall in London every year, the BBC typically, you know, airs it on BBC. They didn't do it this year. And there were signs, and there was a lot of protest against Israel. That is huge. Products are being boycotted. You know, what's it called? Sabra hummus, or whatever it is. The Sabra products are being taken off shelves. Companies, major companies that invest in Israel are losing money because people take them out of their investment portfolios. So there's a growing movement of people who are realizing it's bad for business to deal with Israel. Now, one more thing is that there's an ongoing popular resistance movement in Palestine. There's probably a dozen places, and it grows every few months, of places where Palestinians engage in protest. Peaceful marches every Friday and every Saturday. And when this began, I don't know, 2005, 2006, something like that, there were 1 or 2 places. Today there's probably a dozen. And whenever I'm there, I go and I participate in these protests. And many Israelis do too, many Israeli activists go. But what's interesting is, you know, when Israelis go and participate in these, like when I go, you know, we go, sometimes we get arrested because the army shows up and they beat everybody up. But at the end of the day, you know, the Israelis go home. You know, I get arrested several times, but I know that at the end of the day I'm going home. It's a script that's been, you know, everybody knows in advance. The Palestinians, when they get arrested, they might be in jail for a year. Nobody knows. They might be 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 30-year-olds, it makes no difference. If they get arrested in protest, then they can be incarcerated for periods of time that are indefinite. And what's worse is, a day or 2 later, the Israeli army will raid the village, or raid the town in the middle of the night, barge in, destroy homes, yank kids out of their beds, terrorize families, again, arrest people and so on. And then, what's interesting is this. When these people come out of jail, the first thing they do is they go to the Friday protest. They are unstoppable and undefeatable. And they are so determined that they will never stop. And this is true for the people who govern and run the BDS movement. This is true for all the different groups, all the different pro-Palestine groups in the colleges here in the US and universities. They will not stop. Israel does not understand what kind of resistance it's facing. And that's why the pro-Israeli groups are more and more panicky and more hysterical. They do not understand that they are facing a resistance that cannot be defeated and will not ever stop.